welcome again, Dr. Esselstyn.
Well, Michael, thank you so much. It's delighted again to be with the True North about health, and I look forward to a pleasant hour and a quarter.
All right, beautiful. So while we wait for Dr. Campbell, why don't you go ahead and tell us what you've been up to for the last 5 or 10 years, or and basically the thrust of your body of work, so we can kind of kick that off with that understanding.
Well, the key, I guess, beginning back in 1985, when we did our first study, the whole idea was to see if we couldn't take patients who were seriously ill with cardiovascular disease, and by giving them plant-based nutrition, either halt the progression of this disease or perhaps even reverse it. And this all had its foundation from when you look at 100 years ago, or even more recent than that, we've known that there are multiple cultures on the planet where cardiovascular disease was virtually non-existent. And the common denominator in those countries was the fact that they were largely thriving on whole food, plant-based nutrition. And I think the thing that has been so mysterious is that, let's say, for example, it was in 1924 the American Heart Association was founded. In 1949, the American College of Cardiology. And those are really savvy individuals, and they know full well that there are these cultures where the disease is non-existent. But sadly, the foundation for treating cardiovascular disease in this country does not take that into account. We treat with drugs, stents, and bypass surgery, not one of which has one single solitary thing whatsoever to do with the causation of the illness. So patients get these drugs, but their disease continues. They get the bypass, the disease continues. They get stents, and the disease continues. So it's really rather exciting to have a number of individuals now who are swinging away and getting interested in the fascinating accomplishment that can occur when you use whole food, plant-based nutrition. Because when patients do this correctly, their disease is really is not only halted, but we will frequently see elements of disease reversal.
Great. So what inspired you? So it sounds, I mean, obviously, like you're talking about the history of these other cultures. I assume you learned that kind of once plants, a plant-centered diet was on your radar. What inspired you to even look into plants, and a plant-centered diet as a way of getting healthy?
Well, I think you hit the nail on the head.
Shoot, and then
It was really in the late 19.
gosh, okay, you're in.
I can see Colin Campbell.
Yeah.
I got to say hello. Hey, Colin.
Yeah. Sorry, as I'm creating some confusion here for you and everybody else, probably.
Don't worry about it. There's been lots of talk.
Okay, it says I got to give permission for the thing to be recorded. Yes, I hit okay. Okay.
That's fine. Yep.
Well, when I was chairman of the breast cancer task force in the late 1970s, I became increasingly disillusioned with the fact that for no matter how many women I was doing breast surgery, I was doing absolutely nothing for the next unsuspecting victim. And that led to a bit of global research, and it was quite striking to note that there were many cultures where breast cancer rates were 30 and 40 times less frequent than in the United States. And if you looked at rural China in the 1950s, breast cancer was very infrequently identified, and yet as soon as the Japanese women would migrate to the United States, by the second and third generation, they now had the same rate of breast cancer as their Caucasian counterpart.
Yeah, that's right. 13 times between, for national averages, 13 times in the U.S. compared to China.
So when we looked at Japan, the thing that was one of the most striking bits of information that I learned was that if you looked at the entire nation of Japan, how many autopsy deaths were there from cancer of the prostate? 18. That's the most mind-boggling public health figure I think I've ever encountered. But by the 20 years later, in 1978, they were up to 137, which still pales in comparison to the 28,000 who will die this year in this country from prostate cancer. And it was about then that I began to see in multiple cultures where there was an absolute dearth of cardiovascular disease. It was virtually non-existent. And then it dawned on me there would be more bang for the buck if we could look at the leading killer of women and men in Western civilization, which was cardiovascular disease, because if we could get people to eat to save their heart, they would most likely markedly diminish the likelihood of acquiring the common Western cancers of breast, prostate, and colon. And so to answer your question, that's a little bit of a long answer, but that's when I said we have to.
I got some charts published back in the 50s and 60s and 70s, by the way, not my work, but others, showing exactly what you said. I mean, I was kind of seeing it, make an argument at the experimental level of all things with animals, seeing this wide, very broad effect. But I saw it with the data published in the 50s and 60s, 70s by others, human data. And, you know, it's pretty widespread, as you know. We both talked about that before, so that's spread. Okay, well, I'm on right now, by the way.
So, Colin, I had Dr. Esselstyn so Colin has mentioned that he likes to be called Colin. How do you prefer to be called, Dr. Esselstyn?
No, you call me whatever you like. Colin's fine.
And how about you, Dr. Esselstyn?
Sir.
Sir? All right, yes, sir.
No, you can call me S.
S. Okay, perfect. So, Colin, if you would kind of give us a little bit about yourself for the audience, so they know your background if they're not familiar with it.
Yeah, I got into science accidentally, and it wasn't my intent, but nonetheless, my dad only had a couple years education at the time, and he wanted me to get an education that he didn't have. He was an immigrant from Ireland. So, you know, I went to eventually to university, did my degrees, eventually my graduate degrees, and that's where I came from. I was on the farm, and a typical farm boy, all the rest of it goes with it. And so when I got into Cornell, of all things, you know, it was kind of exciting. There were other people sort of paving my way and doing things, so I got to honor their efforts. But you know, I got into science, and then there was and then in science itself, starting with my doctoral dissertation, I did research to promote the consumption of more animal protein. And that's consistent with my farm background. It's all one and the same. And so what I saw in the Philippines, eventually I was given a responsibility of heading up a malnutrition program for children. And I learned that some of the children as young as 4 years of age were dying of liver cancer. And I had my thoughts on that. But one thing led to another. It was a door open. I got some NIH money to see why that was so. And of all things, animal protein was a very strong promoter of liver cancer, the chief cancer in China at the time. That's how I got into it. I skipped over a lot, but you know, then for over the years, I just kept on seeing surprising things. You know, from the same perspective as I had when I was a kid, I guess you could say, and it was all very exciting.
All right, great. Well, I we'll touch more on stuff that you've accomplished in your career, because there's just between the two of you, there's just so much. How did the two of you even know that each other existed in this world?
I'll be happy to take that one.
Sure.
I was I already had the results of our first study, and I was so frustrated with the fact that I couldn't seem to get the cardiology crew to be aware of the power of plant-based nutrition. So I put together a thing called the First National Conference on the Elimination of Coronary Artery Disease. It was held in Tucson, Arizona, in 1991, and I really wanted to get a blue ribbon faculty, and I was trying to put together this faculty, I happened to read the New York Times and read about this Grand Prix of all nutritional studies. And I thought, well, that's kind of in our bailiwick. Who is this? Turned out to be, it was Colin Campbell. So I said, well, I'll just take a gamble and just see if he'd ever be interested in being on the faculty. And so I gave him a call, and it was really quite wonderful. And that was in 1991. And Colin and I have been really good friends since then. And on multiple times we've been on panels together like we are this evening. And it's always a pleasure from what I can learn from him.
Yeah, I can verify what you said, S. That phone call you rang me, and I thought, wow, this guy he's actually taking people and reversing heart disease. And you told me about your first results, I guess you could say. And I thought it was very exciting because obviously I'm working mostly in the lab to some extent, from China, but a different population, different disease, quite frankly. But you were doing it for real. And so that was pretty exciting.
One thing that was very striking about your China study, I remember when you said you had reviewed the death certificates, and I forget what the province was it was Gansu, and how many of those deaths, there were over 250 death certificates, and I think you could find only one that had died from heart disease. Is that
Yes, that's right. You were at our house at that time, and we were kind of looking at the computer together, some of those data, and you were kind of scanning down there and said, oh my God, look at her. That's not even known or something like that.
Well, so now, one thing that people, because I talk about both of your work with people as I try to, be persuasive, and one thing that people will say when you talk about other countries, especially if they're not as technologically advanced, is that they don't categorize things properly. Was there any chance that there was anything where they didn't track things properly?
Well, we had a chance actually to consider that in a sense with our China study, because we had a lot of counties and stuff like that. We could compare counties and stuff to kind of verify whether the data that we were looking at was realistic or not. There were certain features, a way of looking at data that we could, get a pretty good idea. When you get good correlations of neighboring counties, for example, compared to, counties a little further away, you can sort of rightfully consider that, those data are halfway decent. Oh, wait a minute,
That's it.
Sorry, somebody's ringing my phone here. My wife's taken away. And what took me off? This is really. And she hang the phone up on the long distance discussion board.
So you're talking about the confounding factor of not being able to categorize the.
Hey, Keith, hang up the phone.
Okay.
I apologize for this.
No worries, no worries. So you were talking about the different counties and how you were accounting for the confounding factor that whether or not these counties were able to track whether it was heart disease or not.
Yeah, I mean, as S just said, that he's noticed in the data set we had that heart disease is almost non-existent. One case out of about 300 and some thousand, I think, recorded deaths. It was kind of ridiculous, but no, I was referring to something a little bit different. When you compare neighboring counties and they have dates about the same, compared to counties elsewhere, that's giving you a hint right to start with. That and there are different teams actually surveying those data at the time. So we saw a lot of that, a lot of correspondence, and the Chinese had seen the same thing too. And so they created a really beautiful map, actually, of one map for each of the diseases, from prostate cancer to breast cancer to whatever. And you can see these distributions of the disease around the country. And the counties that had high rates tended to be near each other. And I can't completely answer that question, but nevertheless, that's the patterns we saw.
And Colin, why were you selected, out of all the various researchers to head up the US's the US's involvement with what became known as the China study?
Well, it turns out that the Chinese, there was a Chinese senior team right after Nixon had paid his visit. And there was a team that came from China to the US. And while they were here, they brought along with them their senior scientists, actually. In fact, his grandfather was very famous. He was a comrade of Sun Yat-sen, who overthrew the dynasty way back, 50, 75 years before. So I came and was in New York, and he contacted me to see if he could come and visit at Cornell, and I said, sure. And so arrangements were made. He came to Cornell, and we kind of struck up a discussion, and one thing and another. He was working on selenium and an unusual disease in children in China. And of course, he was somewhat familiar with what I had been doing with cancer. And so we wanted to strike up a conversation. And first thing I know, he wanted to stay, if he could stay behind and work in my lab for what turned out to be 8 months, almost a year. And he actually did some work in my lab based on that work that he did in China involving selenium deficiency. And so, we just got to know each other. We're both, excited about research and lab work and stuff like that. And then he told me about a map they had just created. His colleague had created showing the distribution of cancer around China. And that turned out that colleague at the time was in Bethesda, Maryland. He had visited with pretty high level visits at the time. So he asked him, Li Junyao was his name. He asked him to come up to Cornell. So that's how I met his colleague, Dr. Li Junyao. And I got my hands on the map, and so I ended up actually working a bit with Li Junyao, mostly with Dr. Chen Zhizhou and his colleagues in Beijing. But anyhow, it just an incidental kind of thing. It wasn't a grand plan of making this work. It was just the fact that Chen had come to the United States with a high-level visiting group, kind of official return visit after Nixon's visit. And so I was lucky enough that he knew about my work, and he came to visit Cornell, and we kind of hit it off personally and professionally, and there you have it. And then I saw the atlas they had just produced. I said, wow, this. And then I'm the one suggesting, we need to do some joint research here if we can. Chen stayed behind for 8 months and did some work in my lab. It was all laboratory work, but in the meanwhile, I got very excited about the map. Why don't we set up something like that? So I went to NIH and got the money to do that, joint money it was shared between the United States and China. And then, then a really key person in this whole effort was a guy anointed Sir Richard Peto. He was the world's best known epidemiologist at the time. He was at Oxford University. And so I knew him sort of, and convinced him to come to Cornell. And so we had a team, Chen and Li Junyao and Richard Peto and myself, and we had then our colleagues too. So that's how it really started. Now we just organized the study with 65 counties and 2, locations in each county, so we could compare, similar sites in the same city. 2 villages in each county. They had a different name for them at the time, but we kind of set up research programs, and I thought we did fairly well with it. I had access to Richard Peto at Oxford. I talked to him to come to Cornell. He was a really bright guy and really very familiar with epidemiological research, and so it became a team. Did you hear me?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, my screen is not on right now. No, I don't know why.
Okay. I think you maybe you need your wife/IT department to check.
Yeah, I'm sorry. That's one of my sons.
Just so you know, we can see you fine. So that's
Oh, is that right?
Yeah, that's great. And if you've,
I'm
right,
running the Zoom workplace window right now. I'm going
okay.
to put in my email. I guess that's what you said.
Well, while Colin is looking at that, I would love to hear how your clinical work fit in the context of Colin's lab research, if at all.
Well, I think that we were both involved with some of the major uh, illnesses in this country. Colin has done that wonderful original work that he should tell us about tonight with protein and cancer. And I was focusing on the other leading killer of cardiovascular disease. And the thing that I think is so profoundly impressive is when we take our lead from what we've learned from others. For example, I didn't invent whole food plant-based nutrition. These other, and when you look at rural China, the Papua Highlands in New Guinea, Central Africa, the Tarahumara Indians in northern Mexico, Okinawa, and it really was quite striking that they didn't have this disease that was killing everybody in the West. And that was really the thing that drove me. And about the same time, I would want to be sure that you know that my good friend and colleague, Dean Ornish, totally we didn't even know each other, but we were focusing on the same thing. And he had also very excellent results. And it's the thing about cancer that has what struck me, and I think I'd like to get Colin's comment on this. One of the things that I've always used to try to show the epidemiology of cardiovascular disease is that if you look at the province of Northern Karelia in Finland, that particular province in 1969, 70, 71, 72 was the heart attack capital of the world. And a really strikingly able, enterprising young physician from Helsinki, Pekka Puska, went north to the province of Karelia because this was such a black eye for the country of Finland. And he really worked hard with the people up there and the community leaders. And he took on the dairy industry, got them to stop smoking. And over the next 30 years, the province of Karelia reduced their heart attack rate by 85%. The rest of Finland caught on a little bit later, and they decreased their heart attack rate by 80%. But the figure that I always enjoy seeing is that when the researchers also calibrated how much reduction was there of cancer in Karelia during this time, this 30 years, 67%. Astounding. And there was no chemotherapy, there was no injections, there was no surgery for this. This was simply, these cancers didn't get a chance to grow because of the nutritional modifications that they seem to have made, and they did stop smoking. Go ahead, Colin.
Yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry, I missed some of that. Yeah, I might say something. I was actually had been at MIT before this time we're talking about, and I made really good friends with a Finnish fellow, and he had me to come to Finland, by the way. I don't know if I told you this. Asked him when I was there. I knew about North Korea and that project and so forth. And so my Finnish friend and I had kind of struck up a relationship, like with Chen and with you and so forth. Yeah, I kind of followed the Finnish thing, and I sort of knew of those data. I didn't know very well. You just kind of filled in a blank or two for me. And so, yeah, Finland was, he had a good record as researchers, at least in the area I was in. And at least I knew some people. And yeah, and North Korea, I mean, you kind of pay attention when you're involved there. And I spent some time in Finland. And Yeah, they were very clever, doing some good work, and in the area that I was in, at least. But I did know that there was this also evidence that heart disease was not quite what you might think, and kind of off the chart. It was quite nice to see these data and start comparing them. And so I'm getting ahead of myself here. I'm not telling. I mean, I really started my work in the Philippines when I was asked to put together a childhood malnutrition program. And in those days, it was sort of just obvious, everybody said it, that these children that, are malnourished in various poor countries, that what they need most of all was a good source of protein. And the dairy industry in the United States was sitting ready to go. And they were shipping dried milk powder to these poor countries at the time. And so I'm starting to put together my program. It was based on a study out of India that the children who consumed the most protein, they're the ones that got the liver cancer and died early. And I saw some evidence of that in the cohort of children we had too. So, it just all just started falling in place. And these Western diseases like heart disease, various cancers and so forth, chronic kidney disease and stuff like that, they were kind of aggregated together, sort of, suggesting that there's some commonality between these diseases insofar as causation is concerned. And there you have it. I'm just sort of kind of skipping around, but the whole idea of linking diet with those diseases for me really started with these children in the Philippines. And I knew that some of these children I learned this from colleagues, medical colleagues in the Philippines. One was the assistant to the president of the Philippines, Ferdinand Marcos. And he started telling me about these children unusual, dying from something. And they just thought it was, poor society, and they just couldn't handle it, but they were dying of liver cancer. And that would in turn was related to something I was doing in the lab. And so there it went. I'm kind of skipping around here. My darn computer right now, I'm sorry. Sorry, it's not behaving.
No worries. If you want to take a look at that, you can. If you'd like to have John take a minute to see if he can get it fixed, I can pull him in if you want to have him try. That's up to you.
Well, I'm just trying to get by. Oh, darn it. I apologize for this. This is embarrassing.
No. We see you fine, and you sound great to us. Just so you know.
Colin,
Well,
hey,
thank you.
Colin, this is a panel discussion. We don't have to. We're not making a presentation.
Yes, you're total. Yeah, you're good. You just relax. We can hear you. If all of a sudden you don't hear us talking anymore, well, then you have a problem. But other than that, if you hear us talking, we don't have a problem. We see you perfectly.
Oh, well, Anson and I could talk all day long, I'm sure, but
I know. I enjoy it.
can I make a comment just on that point? I
Sure.
mean, he obviously is a practitioner, clinician, he's working really some high level stuff. He's working on heart disease. He's working with people, and so forth. I'm in the lab and working with rats, to some extent, the children in the Philippines. But the cancer, so we're two different fields, but so we had a lot to talk about. And it turned out that, what we were seeing one way or another, that, diet was pretty important. I mean, as he did his work and he was taking people with heart disease and turned them around. I thought that was spectacular.
I just want to say real briefly, because you kind of sound like you minimized your contributions because you were working with rats. But the two of you in Forks Over Knives is how I even got involved in going whole food plant-based and got into nutrition overall. So you guys, I know so many people who have been inspired by both of your work. So it really, I don't think you can overstate how impactful you've been to so many people for the, both of you gentlemen. So I just want to throw that out there, and I personally appreciate it. So to go back to the county of Karelia,
Korea.
Karelia. Did I get it? In Finland?
Yeah.
How so in New York, Mayor Bloomberg tried to limit the size of sodas that you could buy at one time. I don't know if you guys remember that. It was in I think in the early 2000s, and the amount of pushback he had from that single public policy change was enormous. What kind of policy, and I don't know if you know this level of detail because it's more about public policy, but how did they actually go about implementing those public policy changes to get such incredible results? If I have this right, 80% reduction in heart disease over 30 years and a 67% reduction in cancer over that time. So what kind of policy prescriptions they put in place that got people to actually listen?
Well, for me, I had some direct experience with that, and it was kind of sad and very annoying to say the least. I was, in some policy committees, reporting to congressional committees in Washington, in fact, and so I had a chance in being on these committees or developing policy, and I saw just glaring right up front the interrelationship between the real power in the country, namely the corporations, either the pharmaceutical industry or the ag industry, kind of work together in a sense. One of them sort of encourages the consumption of the wrong food, and they have a membership on the president's, project. What do you call it? I forget. But anyhow, and then on the other end, as the other end of the table is the Health and Human Services. So, the ag industry is being encouraged because of commercial interest, encouraging people to eat the regular old diet, the standard diet, a lot of livestock, a lot of animals, stuff like that. But on the other end, I usually make this kind of like a joke. The Health and Human Services down there say, don't worry about that. We got all the drugs. We got lots of drugs. We could take care of that. So people could stay sick and get well by taking drugs. And both of them kind of leaving out the discussion of nutrition. At least that's my sort of interpretation of those experiences. But I can really tell you a lot about, what I saw among certain individuals, who really were, working themselves in those industries with, and just doing things. And that just really is kind of sad. We have a system that is really not very accurate in what they do, and it's very much influenced by the almighty dollar. And so it's almost like, the way the system works, it's not intentional. I don't want to go down that road, but it's kind of like, it's okay. We can create diseases like cancer and heart disease and their various versions. Don't worry about it. We got some drugs to take care of them, until S came along. And he threw a monkey wrench into that story. And of course, I saw the same thing in China in a different way, but it was clear that nutrition is a really important biological, discipline, if you will, sort of medical discipline. It should be, but it's not taught in medical schools. And so that's another story too. And I'm writing another book right now that's just about done, just on experiences I've had. I call them episodes that really happen at very high levels, especially having to do with policy, and the kind of people who actually participate in helping develop those policy positions. I have seen I'm going to say, infestation of the community, the research communities, the medical research communities, the infestation of that with, people with big money. That's the way it works. And so it's very sad.
Well, I've read 4 of your books, so I'm looking forward to reading. I think you told us you're thinking of calling it The Whole Truth.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. That's what the publishing house sort of suggested.
Yeah, I think it dovetails very nicely. So, going back to Finland and their public policy prescriptions, do you know how they were able to implement that?
No, it would be largely the work of Pekka Puska, who I mentioned,
Right.
who worked on stopping the smoking. I gather up there was a tradition of putting clotted cream on practically everything you ate. And that obviously would work. And he got into trouble, or not trouble, but he got some vigorous opposition from the dairy industry. And other than that, I think he really tried to focus them away from a meat-based diet to one that was more plant-based. But I want to just follow up for a minute on what Colin said. I think that when you think that every 5 years, the United States Department of Agriculture makes a food pyramid for the public to be aware of and to follow. And when you see the food pyramid, it's no surprise that who was on the committee. The head of the dairy industry, the head of the cattle industry, Mars bars industry. And I had a saying that I'll restore for you tonight. Having the United States Department of Agriculture prepare your food pyramid is like having Al Capone do your taxes.
Well said. Well said. So along the lines of Colin's comment about the corrupting power of the almighty dollar, I got to be careful here. How has the Cleveland Clinic, or has the Cleveland Clinic made a meaningful effort to implement your findings in their standard of care, if you will?
Not as fully as I would like. We get occasionally, because you have to remember this. I am an enormous threat to medicine's biggest cash cow. These large clinics with all the identification and diagnostic procedures, plus stents, plus bypasses, drugs. I mean, there's an enormous amount of money that's involved there. And it's really going to, it's coming, but it's so much slower than really I would advise. But if you don't mind, I want to read something that was sort of a takeaway on something that my good friend Michael Greger just came out with yesterday that has to do with what's happening in the field of cardiology. Research shows that stents, while frequently performed, do not reduce the risk of heart attacks or death in patients with stable coronary artery disease. However, nearly 90% of patients mistakenly believe that it lowers heart attack risk, contrasting with cardiologists' knowledge that it doesn't. Now, we also have to say that when you're in the middle of a heart attack, a stent can be really life-saving. But we do about several hundred thousand of these every year. And many cardiologists continued recommending and performing stents despite evidence to the contrary. They justify their actions with vague beliefs, such as the idea that an open artery is inherently better, and downplay the risk involved. Stents provide temporary chest pain relief for some patients, but this benefit often disappears after a year. The procedure carries risks, including serious complications of heart attack, stroke, or death for 1 in 100 people, and bleeding events or stent blockage during the first year post-procedure. There is a gap in patient understanding, partly due to poor communication or physicians' inadequate grasp of relevant statistics. Tools like informed consent, documents, and decision-making aids aim to bridge this gap by clearly presenting the benefits, risks, and alternatives. Stent manufacturers promote stents with emotionally charged, misleading ads, framing them as life-saving interventions. However, evidence suggests that the symptomatic relief provided by stents may largely stem from a placebo effect and raises questions about its true value. So that's really taking the hammer to something that is a huge money earner for the cardiology community. This is not to say, as I said before, a stent can be absolutely life-saving when in the face of a heart attack, but they don't prolong life and they don't protect against future heart attacks.
Well, thank you for sharing that. I haven't had a chance during the conference to check out what Michael Greger is posting. I think a lot of us follow his work, And that's very well said. What are other side effects that could happen after a person gets a stent put in?
Well, he mentioned it very clearly. You can die, you can have a stroke, you can have a heart attack, and you remember that you have to have anticoagulation for this during this period while the new endothelial cells are grown over the bare metal stent. And during this period, when you're anticoagulated, you can have a major bleed, either cerebral hemorrhage or gastrointestinal hemorrhage. So that it's not without risk by any means.
So along the same lines, and I've asked this question of Colin, and I years ago, Colin and Dr. Kim Williams were on a panel together, and they were talking about statins, and I brought this up with many people about the efficacy of statins and whether or not they really work. And I get, Dr. Kim Williams still says absolutely they definitely work. We had Dr. John Abramson on. I don't know if you're familiar with his work. He said that that it takes so many people over such a long period of time for them to prevent a single event, even with people who had a heart attack. So it's hard to tell. It's hard for the layperson to know whether or not they should take a statin. So I'll ask each of you, based on your understanding, your research, your experience, do statins work?
Okay, go ahead, S.
Well, there's no question that they work in terms of lowering your cholesterol, because what they do is they poison an enzyme system in the liver, the HMG-CoA reductase. But when the manufacturers of stent didn't like the idea of saying it poisoned the enzyme system, so they use a term called inhibit. It inhibits it seems it's a little bit more delicate when you use that word.
Sounds
But
better.
there's no question that at least the data that I'm familiar with, that stents can help. But you see, the problem with them is often patients, once they take a stent and they see that their cholesterol is plummeting, and they think that this is really wonderful, and because it's right down in the area where they want it, and of course, what happens? They don't ever talk about the food, so they continue to eat the same old Western diet, and despite the fact they've got these glorious numbers, the injury to the endothelium continues, and their disease progresses, maybe not as rapidly. So you can say it maybe slows the rate of disease progression. But I think what to me is so disturbing about it, none of the drugs, none of the stents, none of the bypasses, as I said earlier, has one single solitary thing whatsoever to do with the causation of the illness. And as you have seen in the paper that I read earlier today, our results were 30-fold more favorable than the common ones that are seen out there. Why is there this difference? Because really there's been a basic covenant of trust since the days of Hippocrates that whenever possible, the physician will share with the patient what is the causation of the illness. And sadly today in cardiovascular medicine, that is simply not being done.
Any thoughts, Colin, on statins?
Yeah, I that's been kind of a favorite for me, and I wrote a book on it called Whole. That was after the John study, whether you saw that or not. But I taught for years in the biochemistry field, general biochemistry and pharmacology biochemistry and so forth and so on. So I've been fairly close to that concept of the complexity, of the body in regards to, all the reactions that go on in so-called intermediary metabolism. And I mean, they're infinite in terms of the interactions they have with each other and with, they're standing alone. And so often what we've gotten caught up in, certainly in the area of nutrition, but I would argue too, also in the area of medicine, that we tend to want to focus on one observation or one event or one substance at a time. And it sounds kind of good. It sounds very professional and fancy, that sort of stuff. But when we look at one reaction that supposedly accounts for a very major disease, let's say, And then we're going to create we're going to find some chemical to treat that disease, very, very complex disease, and treat it and just hitting one reaction in that mixture. Just the odds, just looking at that, you can tell that the whole idea of using drugs to treat illness, in a sense, is what I call reductionism. Taking one chemical, in the case of drugs, it's not just taking one nutrient, or you might see something there, but it's actually taking a drug with a synthetic derivative of a nutrient. And that's necessary because you can't patent nutrients, so you can patent, synthetic derivatives. And so that gets us into a very different ballgame. And I was making an argument in the book Whole, and the new book I'm doing is extending beyond that. I really have a problem with the way we think about causes and effects in this area that we might call medical science. When we look at one thing and just in isolation almost as if that is the answer, there's a big mistake, because nutrition, for a start, is not one thing at a time doing this thing, whatever it is. It's all the nutrients together that it comes from consuming the right food. And that's basically plants, a variety of that. And they work in these marvelous ways together. And to try to pick up one thing at a time and make some progress on it, or make claims about it, make some money on it, if you can. I really have a problem with that. And so I had used Esselstyn, I talked about this a bit. I've used a statin story at the time, because right at the time, they were just coming out in the late 80s, just the time I was working in this area. They're working with NIH to some extent. And they were just coming out with lovastatin, I think was the first one that they came out with at the time. And I got some pushback from the people in the heart disease area. The sort of, you're not experiencing heart disease, you don't know what you're talking about, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I was just using only that example as an example of, because there's real data here to show that when we do it that way, one thing at a time, yeah, you can actually produce an effect. It looks maybe oppressive, especially with regard to that one event, but that doesn't speak for the whole concept of nutrition, which is, infinite numbers of nutrients and combination of nutrients and time-dependent reactions and stuff like that. It's an extraordinarily complex system. So I think we've tried to simplify science, especially biological science, down to one thing at a time, because our heads can't manage more than that. And so I think that what we have to do is to figure out a way, and I think there are some ways, to actually analyze cause and effect relationships, according to a grander scheme, if I can say it that way. Like whole foods, everything working together. And we did some research just on that point. And it turns out that, just to name animal protein for example, when it provokes cancer, it's very dramatic. And I started looking at to see, well, how does that work? And I was looking for the mechanism. So maybe you could have a drug to block it, if you will, something like the statins. And what I found over a period of, about 10, 12 years or so, with some students, each of them doing a thesis, every time we looked for a mechanism, we found one. That's more or less true. And I ended up with a whole bunch of mechanisms, changing their activities when the disease comes along. Some of them increase, some decrease, but the end result was that they all do the same thing, the same, major effect. And that just struck me as really quite exciting, because when they all operate that way, and then you go to some other nutrients as well, or substance in food, and you find the same phenomenon occurring. I like to say Mother Nature, I think, knew what she was doing for millions of years, and fashioned that complexity. But it really works, and so we got to deal with the concept of complexity to really appreciate, and that's where nutrition comes in. And unfortunately, in my area, in nutrition, we tend to focus and do the same thing. We talk about individual nutrients, how much do we take, what do they do, et cetera, et cetera. And so the same thing happens in medical practice, I think, or those disciplines related to that. We like to think that we can find one thing to explain our observation, if you will. we get into trouble when we do that. Because then, especially when you start using that one thing with it's something that's synthetic, it's because we want to get a patent for it. And so we're asking for trouble, a lot of side effects. Some of them are not so good. And it's just a different concept, I think, that we need to deal with and discuss. And
Michael, I would like to make a comment about a patient, if I may.
Absolutely.
The oldest patient that I ever started on our program was 87, and he'd been told that he had to have bypass surgery, but he was convinced that as frail as he was, when they sawed him in half for bypass surgery, he was convinced that he wouldn't tolerate it. He would die. So he wanted to go plant-based, and he became a wonderful patient. And he was from California, and every year he would call, giving me an update on how he was doing. And about 3 years ago, when he called, he wanted to speak with Ann. And the reason was he was wanting to speak with Ann because he wanted from Ann multiple recipes because he's having a fairly large party. So Ann's curiosity said, well, could you share with me what's the party about? And he said, well, I'm celebrating my 100th birthday.
Wow.
Sure enough, that was 3 years ago. Well, 2 years ago, he called again to want to be sure to remind us that he was now 101. This year, when we got his phone call, he wanted to be sure to remind us that he was now 103.
Wow. How old was he when he came to you?
87.
87. All right. I mean, that makes me feel good that, it's really never too late to begin. If you can recover from heart disease at 87 and add another, 14 years or I guess that's 16 years of life and going is amazing and really inspiring. Now,
I might add to that, as S knows, we talk about it quite a bit. We're almost the same age. He's got me by 3 months. We're both 91. And, I know in my case, in my wife's case, together, I was sort of willing to move forward and start taking it seriously. At that time, I was in my early 50s. She was in her late 40s. A little bit too late. Some would argue that making change would make a difference. Well, she had cancer in her family. I had heart disease in my family. And so we changed our diets. Now I'm 91, 3 months behind S. He's 91. And Karen's still around with us. So she's 84. And I think, I don't know what Ann is, but, I think just between the four of us, S and I and our wives, I guess you should knock on wood. You probably shouldn't tell that story because you never know what's going to happen next. But I think we are, in fact, in a way, demonstrating a little something. Karen got diagnosed with advanced melanoma of all things, pretty serious, as S knows, and she wouldn't take any medication. And her caretaker got mad at her, and so she didn't take anything, and she did just fine with the melanoma. Got past it and through it.
wow. That's inspiring. So S, when you began your research and you started doing that study, did you have any inkling that not only would it prevent the disease from getting worse, but it actually might reverse the disease?
I was hoping that would be the case, but I would have to say there probably was data that came from in the concentration camps in World War II, where those poor prisoners, all they were getting to eat was vegetable gruel. There was really quite an absence of coronary artery disease that was seen there. And also there had been some experiments done actually in dogs that showed that you could reverse the disease if you gave it to them first with a very high fat diet. But it was really yet to be seen whether it would help in patients who already had advanced cardiovascular disease. And what seems to happen, we probably really still don't know what is going on at the level below the cellular level. When you get into the actual discussion about biochemistry, when you take it to the nth degree, you're really talking more about physics and photons and things like that, which we really haven't really bothered to investigate as much as perhaps we should in the future. But the key, I think, is when you're eating whole food, plant-based nutrition, if you were to look at your inflammatory indices, for example, oxidized LDL, asymmetric dimethylarginine, myeloperoxidase, and HSCRP, and it's really quite fascinating that when you're eating plant-based, those inflammatory markers will be quite low, and you know that what you're doing is very exciting and very wonderful, and it keeps disease and illness from progressing, because we haven't talked about the side effects of whole food plant-based nutrition. People always say, what are the side effects? And I tell them, well, you get rid of your hypertension, you get rid of your diabetes, you get rid of the risk of stroke, you get rid of Crohn's disease, ulcerative colitis, rheumatoid arthritis, lupus, and multiple sclerosis, allergies, and asthma, and the list goes on. Medicine has never, ever before had the heavens open and give us a tool like whole food plant-based nutrition to absolutely vanquish chronic illness.
Well said. Whose work that's being done now looks inspiring or hopeful for the future? Like, who should we be looking at, as people are looking for more?
I think Neil Barnard always has something in the offing that I think you'll find fascinating. So keep your eye on what Neil is doing. I think that'll keep you excited. And also, my friend Dean Ornish has looked at prostate cancer in the early stages and thinks that plant-based nutrition can do a wonderful thing for helping not only stop the cancer, but also will enhance your telomeres.
Oh, really?
Yeah,
So which would increase our longevity.
that's the idea. And certainly this fellow in Boston, Sinclair, is doing some very interesting things where increasingly people are looking at aging is an illness. If you think of aging as an illness, this really gets to some really serious thinking about why the organ systems begin to crumble.
And with regard to Sinclair's work, is he looking at it from a holistic perspective or a constitutional perspective?
I can't answer that.
Okay.
Maybe Colin would.
No, I don't know his work, actually.
Okay.
Interesting.
Because it also, with the idea of medicalizing everything, right? I mean, they medicalize the menopause, for example. It gets a little scary where where like just what might be natural progressions could also get medicalized. So I'd love to see his work. His name is Sinclair, you said?
That's right. He's written a book.
I'm sorry?
He has written a book.
Okay. Yeah, I'll check it out. Is he out of Boston University?
He's with Harvard.
Oh, Harvard? Okay.
Yeah.
All right, perfect. And so Colin, you coined the term whole food plant-based. When you coined that term, did that mean whole food plant exclusive?
I just found myself in a kind of unsuspecting place. This was in the late 1970s at the time. I was on a committee of cancer researchers, and we were charged with the responsibility of coming up with some recommendations, if you will. And all of the people on the committee, others on the committee, were all chemotherapists and cancer researchers, and they didn't know much about nutrition. They were taking in invitations. They're working for NIH, they were taking in invitations from researchers to study this, that, or something else. And some applications started to come in the area of nutrition, but my colleagues they were all, as they say, cancer research. They didn't know anything about nutrition. And so they asked me the next meeting to come and, tell about nutrition. As if I could do that. But, I thought about it. And at that time, the only word that was at all similar to this was vegetarian. I didn't particularly want to do that because the science surrounding the authenticity of vegetarianism was focused, I thought, poorly. And so I just tried to come up with some word that might be a better description of what we're talking about. And that's when I came up with the whole, because at that point, I was really becoming aware of how these nutrients work together at the cellular and intracellular levels. And plants, of course, I've already crossed that bridge. The closer we get to just eating plants and then recognize their kind of metabolic activity when they're actually doing the work at a cellular level. I came up with that word. I also was at the time serving the government, giving testimony on nutrient supplements. And so I was kind of put to the task on that one. And I'm not fond of supplements. They can have effect, maybe in the short term, sometimes, but it doesn't last. It's not the way to really remain healthy, just going all over the place and trying to find some nutrient supplements, to eat. I thought, we have some data too that nutrient supplements, when they're in food, working with all the other stuff in there too, they tend to do one thing, but when they're taken alone, they do something different. And so that's where I was asked to give a bit of a lecture to my colleagues on that committee. And I just had to struggle a bit, and I just came up with the idea that I like the word whole and I like the word plant-based. That's where it came from. And anyhow, not much of an answer, but that's
Well, what I'm trying to get at with my question is, did that mean that there was zero animal products? If someone was whole food plant-based, does that mean they ate zero animal products?
Yes, it really did, but I don't say it that way. I don't be assertive about that particular point of view. But I don't see any evidence that we have a need for animal protein. Plants have all the protein we need, and but animal protein, at least for those of us in the nutrition community, animal protein was the golden eagle. Essentially, we center our diets and have for hundreds of years around the idea that we need some protein and it should be animal based and etc. like that. And so we've kind of lived with a paradigm for quite a long time now that just has an unusual respect or almost worship of animal protein. In our work, we were, turning cancer on with animal protein, turning it off with plant protein. Pretty dramatic. I mean, really, really very striking. And so I, kind of gotten fond of the idea of keep staying with that whole food, plant-based kind of thing because of real evidence. And yeah, and I don't like to to say something negative about the vegetarian or vegan communities, but I thought that the scientific basis for their arguments was not terribly impressive. It was focused on fat and wrong kind of fat too. And so anyhow, I just threw it out there, and I was, I had to say it out loud at some communities and giving presentations, kind of stuff. I published that idea too, and it kind of got a foothold and kind of hung around, I guess.
Thank you. Now, I want to get both of your opinions on this. So in the future of nutrition, if I understood you correctly, Colin, you mentioned that dietary cholesterol does not increase serum levels of cholesterol. And so would it be understood as dietary cholesterol does not cause heart disease? Is that a correct interpretation of what you said?
Well, I kind of leaned on my friend. That's, as I was going through this sort of thing, I don't see the consumption of cholesterol as being an answer to the question of what's wrong with the diet. That's too focused, just one nutrient, so-called nutrient, I should say. Forget where I was going with here, but there's lots of nutrients from the nutritional perspective. What we miss in this, and nutrition is not taught well at all. In my community as well, and I did a lot of teaching myself as well as the medical community. Nutrition is a concept whereby I use the word infinite carefully, but it's almost like there's infinite supply of nutrients and analogs and variations of these nutrients in plant foods, and they all seem to work together. And so when we worship animal protein, therefore we eat animal foods. That's very well documented. And when we increase the consumption of animal foods, we decrease the consumption of plant foods. And so you got two effects working together. One is you increase animal protein, you increase the disease risk, and you're decreasing plant foods, that also increases disease risk too. So I just find the concept kind of exciting and a very old idea that goes way back to the ancient Greeks, actually. I didn't answer your question, I don't think, very well, but
No, I think I took it that we really need to be looking at the whole picture, not just a particular element of food. So what are your thoughts on that?
On when you say that,
On the cholesterol, do you believe that dietary cholesterol increases serum cholesterol? And to Colin's point, does it even matter if if you're not taking the whole picture into account, where you're only getting cholesterol from eating an animal product, essentially?
oh, the only place you can get cholesterol is through eating animal products.
Right.
Yeah. And and surely that's going to coax it a little long, but it's your liver that has everybody has their own thermostat in their liver that determines what level of cholesterol they would make eating the same foods. Granted, your cholesterol will often come down precipitously when you eat whole food plant-based nutrition. However, there'll be many other people who will eat absolutely correctly whole food plant-based nutrition, and they will not be able to significantly lower their cholesterol. But that doesn't mean they're necessarily more at risk, because if they're eating this way correctly, as I mentioned earlier, if you measure their inflammatory indices, even if your liver is making extra cholesterol, you can still make yourself an endothelial fortress by getting rid of all the inflammation. When you get rid of the inflammation, you're not going to have the oxidation of LDL. You're not going to have tumor necrosis factor alpha and interleukin-9 and all the other inflammatory stuff. And because I know perfectly well people that I've followed for close to 40 years who never got their cholesterol below 200, let's say, not even a hint of heart disease.
Wow. Okay. Well, that's great to hear. So I've got one more really important question for you, Colin, which is, you talked about aflatoxin in peanuts, and specifically in peanut butter back in the day. Is there still aflatoxin in my peanut butter today in the United States?
no, actually, the FDA have shared their data with me because they have pretty routinely, they organize a program to test for aflatoxin in peanut butter over the years, and actually it worked out that the program has worked fairly well. And I don't know how they're doing it, but just stay away from molded peanuts for starts. It's good quality peanuts, but it's not talked about very much, to be honest about it. I mean, I learned quite a lot from what I learned using that model, but at the time it was a serious problem. But now I think it's pretty well under control.
Great, thank you, gentlemen. That concludes our time. I just want to say what an honor it has been to be able to talk to you guys and learn directly from you. S, I want to thank you for putting in 3 hours and 15 minutes today. It gets exhausting, and you inspire me to want to wear a shirt and tie, actually. So I appreciate that. So
Well, I
th-
have one final thought, and that is
Yeah.
that I guess I'm still very optimistic, and I see it in front of us that on the horizon, there's going to be a seismic revolution in health. And this revolution in health will never come about through another pill, another drug, another stent, another bypass, but this revolution in health will come about when we share with the public the nutritional literacy that will empower them to absolutely annihilate chronic illness.
great, thank
I second that.
thank you, gentlemen, for sharing that. It's very inspirational, and I hope for that future for sure. If we can unmute the audience, please, so they can share their appreciation for Dr. Esselstyn and Dr. Campbell, please.
Thank you very much.
The best.
And thank you, Dr.
Campbell.
very much.
Thank you.
Thank you
Dr.
so much.